Today's theme is called Breaking In, New Roadmaps. There's going to be a lot of great information today, and the underlying idea here is ways in which we can create more opportunities in the documentary community for new voices, greater diversity. And to kick this off, as usual, we're going to do our half-hour morning manifesto, where we pick someone that we think has a lot to say, and in a kind of lightning round of a half hour, try to get their best thoughts out of them. So this morning's in the hot seat is Michèle Stephenson. Michèle has a long history as a filmmaker, frequently collaborating with her husband, Joe Brewster. One of their best-known projects is American Promise, a film shot over 12 years following two young African-American boys, one of them their son, as they navigate their way through private schools in New York City. So Michèle, when we had talked about this, one of the things that I'd asked you is I wanted to use this occasion, use this platform to talk about ways in which the documentary community can be doing more to support emerging voices. And I suggested to you, let's come up with 5 points that we can talk about on this topic. And I think you've done your homework and delivered them, right?
Yes, hi. I just want to say one thing. I'm kind of nervous because over the past 2 years since American Promise came out, I've been talking about diversity and equity in the education world all over the country. I had hundreds of screenings, hundreds of workshops and talks. And it's kind of like, but I've been thinking a lot also about my community itself, the documentary filmmaking community, what transfers and what doesn't. And so these are part of what is kind of going on in my head, given the experiences that I've had in conversations around these issues in the education area.
Well, let me start by asking you, how do you think the documentary community does around making space for diverse voices?
Well, it's a work in progress. I think if you look at the 5 points that I've kind of emerged out of this, one has to do with looking at diversity, really for me as a form of social justice, in the sense that in the documentary world, much like every other field, our community, our industry really reflects the larger inequities that exist in society. So we have to be proactive in being aware of how is it that some of these inequities are perpetuating themselves. And it's very difficult. So for me, diversity, when we talk about diversity and bringing in inclusion, it's really a tool, not an end. We in the documentary world talk a lot about doing social issue films that create change. But part of that has to be also the practice of creating change in our own spaces. So the second point, what I was looking at diversity and social justice. We now, by the way, have
your slides up there.
Right. So how are we doing? I think we're probably doing better than we did a few years ago, but there's a long way to go. And I think part of the process is it's kind of layered. It's understanding the systemic issues that exist, but being very personal and intentional in our work. So in that sense, it means for me, as a light-skinned woman of color of Haitian and Panamanian descent, what is it that I bring to the table? What are the privileges that I have in my interactions with my subjects? The perhaps disadvantages in terms of how I am perceived with funders and with my colleagues. But it's not just, and I think that we as people of color have had to have those questions all the time around. I think dominant culture or white filmmakers and funders have not perhaps had the same amount of tools to be able to question their role. And how, so I'm kind of rambling a bit. So for me, diversity is really the first step. we can have a lot of diversity within a specific space. We can bring in filmmakers of color, but we must also question the dynamics of our interactions. And how are we really affecting the power structure if we're talking about social change? So, yeah. So that's
All right,
one.
so let's. I
one.
haven't seen this.
Yeah.
This set of. So, talk about diversity of social justice, gatekeepers.
Yes. So if I look at gatekeepers are key because I'll take my example of American Promise and its journey in terms of its funding journey and its story. I would not be here sitting with you if it weren't for the funders of color who were in the positions of power, who were able to advocate for our story, but also who were able to understand our story enough to be able to advocate for it. And that goes from the very start, the very little grant we got with NYSCA, thanks to the program officer of color who was there when we were like 3 years into the project, up to the end. And so it's not just about bringing filmmakers in, it's also about changing the face of those who are letting stories in and deciding on the stories. Yeah, so that's that point in terms of understanding that the gatekeepers hold the key to who tells the story and how the story is told.
What you got? Number 3 here is mentorships.
Yeah. Well, I kind of started from a systemic perspective where we look at diversity as a tool to really looking at how we dismantle. How do we try to dismantle inequities that exist where diversity is just one tool among many? And then going further closer into terms of me as my own filmmaker and looking at my craft. I need somebody around me who can guide me in the process. And there are multiple ways of having mentors. There are mentors who help with the actual craft. There are mentors who help us, who open doors. And there are mentors who help us connect with other colleagues as well. So for me, again, sitting here, there are certain people that I know, such as St. Clair Bourne, who's no longer with us, who was key to helping me even bounce off ideas with him, both Joe and I, bounce off ideas with us, okay, no, we're not crazy about the story that we want to say. Because he's kind of, in some ways, was a pioneer on many levels. And there are other mentors throughout the journey that are key. So I speak as a mentee, but also I speak as a certain mentor as well. Because now, because of the journey that I have done, there's so much information that I can share and that I feel is key for me to be able to express and connect with others. So,
I wonder if we could draw out some specific examples. I mean, I have to credit the organization Chicken and Egg, and not just because there's a sponsor, but because they've really, hit the ground running with doing a lot of great mentoring. I think of Firelight Media that Stanley Nelson runs, and the work they do. I think of the Maisels Institute in Harlem and a lot of the training they're doing. Here's a chance to point out some others. Or have I just exhausted the list?
Well, I think those are main ones, and I think there's a lot to be said. Those are very structured ones. Some of which have funding that are key to greater mobility, being able to tell our stories, to being able to get feedback. But there's also something to be said about informal one-on-one relationships. We have a couple of filmmakers that we work with, but very much on an individual one-on-one basis. So there is a bond of trust also that's created. Where information is shared. Actually, we have 2 filmmakers who actually are, one of whom is a grantee of Chicken and Egg now. They're doing a film called Cuenca, Isabel Alcantara. And she's come to our office, we've spoken, we've discussed her piece, and that's kind of an informal relationship that was built that kind of is becoming more and more structured as a result of that initial connection. So I think we have to try to navigate both, but what I mean by that is that the idea that we also, once we've gone through the journey, need to be open to connecting where the structures may not perhaps answer all the questions. So it's really trying to combine all of those, because you need all of those in your back pocket. But also, I go back to this our funders, the gatekeepers of our gatekeepers of color that I call they're kind of my archangels. Guardian angels, sorry, not archangels, guardian angels, who served a very significant role in mentoring. Orlando Bagwell, for example, for me was key on some very politically strategic things that we had to address with one of our subjects, the Dalton School, in really helping us navigate that world in a way that was very diplomatic. So mentorship takes so many forms, so I really think it's important to be open.
To say, Orlando Bagwell was at the Ford Foundation,
yes.
And now he's at University of California, Berkeley, running is it the film program or the journalism department that he runs?
I think it's the journalism school, but the document, So yeah.
All right, so let's look at point number 4, community.
Yeah. Well, community is kind of an extension, I think, of mentorship. But for me, again, it's about kind of survival in the process and being able to be in it as seeing it as a marathon and not a sprint. And part of what you need that cup of water. You need to be able to have that cup of water to drink. And that cup of water sometimes doesn't come from a mentor or someone who has power, but it comes from someone going through the struggle with you. And those connections, I feel, are really key to being able to, wake up the next day, believe in the story that you're saying, being able to pick up the phone and exchange just, this is what happened to me today. So it's really important to stay outside of our silos. And it's very easy to stay in our silos.
And let me ask you, in fostering community, what have been some of the most useful things for you?
DOC NYC. It's been a great opportunity to, again, have the opportunity to see people that I'm not seeing as often as I would like to. I think about the festival, other festivals, going to Sundance Film Festival as a grantee, as a DOC grantee, and having that community there. That, of course, cuts across communities as well. I mean, there's the specific, perhaps, filmmakers of color communities, but there's also the larger just connecting as DOC filmmakers. The Tribeca All Access program was for me seminal in terms of creating a shift in not only believing in the work that I was doing because it was validated, but also I connected to people that I kept in touch with who now are co-producing one of our next films. She's based in Toronto. I'm just talking about how when you keep community and connection, you don't know what might happen in 2 to 3 years. You may be working together. There may be doors opening for one of you that, and then you'll think about them or they'll think about you and you can collaborate.
Well, I think of so many people who worked for me when I was a filmmaker as a production assistant who now, are in gatekeeper positions. So that's something always to be mindful of. Treat your production assistants well.
Yeah.
All right. Your last point here, point of view. What do you mean by point of view?
Okay, this is probably the most, I would say it's I think, the most controversial. And I think it goes back to the question of the systemic inequities and to the question of diversity being a tool for social justice. And what I mean is that I think that as a documentary community, we need to start questioning who's telling whose story. Because very often, because of the competition that exists, one story about one person of color or one community of color gets told, and it's that one perspective that remains. And I think that in some cases it's not even about new voices. We have other voices that have been around, but just don't have that same access and opportunity. And in some cases, the bar at times is higher. Because I was just speaking to some young filmmakers of color the other day, and they were talking about, we're getting these, reactions about, and they're doing a story around Ferguson, talking about, we're going to try to be objective, we're going to try to be impartial, we want to make sure, and I'm like, no, no, no. Impartiality and objectivity are really tools of stopping you from telling your story. And I said, what is one filmmaker's access to a community is perceived as another filmmaker's being too close to his or her community. And that's what I mean by self-reflection in terms of diversity as social justice. It's really a daily practice. The same way we practice yoga, or we practice basketball, or we practice this. Intentional change towards against systemic injustices that we have internalized, all communities have internalized, requires a daily awareness. And those questions have to be discussed at the table, openly. Because I think some of us, and we have to lean into that discomfort, because some of us are more comfortable than others to discuss it. But it's so crucial. And I think about my son right now is demonstrating out at Occidental College. They're occupying the space of the president of the university. It's part of this wave of what's going on in Mizzou and these other spaces, from Yale to Princeton. And I always think of him in terms of my intentionality in the work that I'm doing. So he's out there. The other day asked me, Mommy, am I in a revolution? And I said, well, maybe it's a movement. Could be revolution too. It all depends. But it's really about, let's take this to the next level. We have to. And taking it to the next level means being uncomfortable. It's not just the numbers. It's what do we mean about the numbers? Am I doing this diversity because in order to feel better about myself? Or am I doing it to really disrupt? So,
I think if you have to ask your mom, then you're not in a revolution.
Depends on who your mom is. It
makes me think of Stanley Nelson, who's at the festival this year with his film Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, as part of our shortlist section. And he had said in the 7-year journey of making that film that he would have funders say, well, we're not sure that a black filmmaker is the right person to tell this story. Bringing up the whole question of objectivity.
Yeah, and you're right, and also, but
it's hard to imagine even someone saying that out loud.
Sometimes, this is the difficulty. Sometimes it's not out loud.
Right.
Sometimes
Good point.
it's not even intentional. Sometimes it's unconscious. They don't even have to say. They just talk about objectivity and partiality, and everybody's like, nobody's disrupting the conversation.
It's just moving one proposal from the accepted pile to the rejected pile.
Which is why having our gatekeepers in positions, our people of color in positions of power, or people from who have a different take on certain things, important to be at the table. I mean, if you want to take that example, for us, our story is a black middle class story, unapologetic about it, right? Well, that was difficult for funders to understand at the beginning. We had funders tell us, well, why is this story worthy? You guys have you've made it. It's like, this is not understanding the systemic nature, but also saying, we fund films that are about, the inner city. This is what we want. This is what makes sense. This is what kind of really addresses the issue. Really not having that structural understanding, and it was because we had, people in these positions to be able to, I guess in this case, for lack of a better word, translate, the experience.
So with a couple minutes left, I wonder if there's anything more you'd want to say prescriptive. I mean, it probably goes without saying from your points that we could use more people in leadership, to diversify those ranks. Is there anything else that you would want to recommend to organizations or film festivals or other kind of leaders in this community to do specifically?
Well, I guess two things. I want to say one thing to the filmmakers and then one thing to the structures that exist. I think we need to question our privilege. We need to question, again, as I talked about this daily practice, it's really about coming to the table, coming every day and analyzing and looking and not being afraid to self-reflect. What is it that I'm doing that's not really making this change deep and long-lasting? Now, that may be a little bit, but it's about shifting a little bit the perspective and having that daily check-in. So I think that's really key. And I think for filmmakers, it's really about this question of community that is, I think, key to being able to survive over the long term, because it is a marathon. It's not.
And something that I'm hearing from you is that there's, a top-down version of this, and then there's a grassroots version of this. Exactly. As a filmmaker, you don't have to wait for someone to give you a grant, although that would be wonderful, and you should obviously put as much pressure as you can to make that happen. But you can be drawing a lot of strength from your fellow filmmakers.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. That's right.
Michèle, thank you so much. Let's thank Michèle Stephenson for joining us this morning.